Greetings, welcome to the show. This is The Overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today we're going to take a look at a subject relating to the African continent, or mainly you say the Black world, because it includes the African continent and the Caribbean. I'll be touching on, not really on America, mainly the Caribbean and Africa. I was going to mention the African American community, but it's not really part of this program. So anyway, I'm looking at trade and these trade agreements that were formulated in the last 20 to 30 years. So I'll be taking a look at some of the detrimental sides. I'll be going into the details as to the criteria of what these trade agreements are, such as the AGOA for one, and then this agreement between the EU and the Caribbean, some countries in the Caribbean. So, you know, trade between Western countries and Africa and the Caribbean has been more or less imbalanced or one-sided. It has been mainly concerned with extraction, historically, extraction from Africa and the use of human labor in the Caribbean. Human labor in terms of farming on plantations for certain types of crops which the Europeans wanted. And from Africa up till today, it's about natural resources and the exploitation of such resources. Even though they're supposed to be making agreements in which the West is supposed to be more equitable or is held to account in terms of how it has been treating African countries. So, for example, recently there's discussions about, or talk about, the Congo's concern about how Western corporations are using rebels to run mines in Eastern Congo to extract resources or natural resources such as coltan, gold, and whatsoever to carry off or steal basically and take to Europe or America without paying taxes. Even though the Congolese government is trying to crack down on these things, it's a long process. So at least the move has been made in the right direction. Anyway, in terms of these trade agreements, I'm going to be looking at what they call these free trade agreements and economic partnership agreements. And the one in Africa is the AGOA agreement, as I mentioned, and then there's an EPA between the EU and what they call the CARIFORUM group of Caribbean countries, a group of 14 Caribbean countries that signed an agreement to trade with the EU. So I think I'll start off with the explanation of what a free trade agreement is. So a free trade agreement is a pact between two or more nations to reduce barriers to imports and exports among them, between them, or among them, you can say. Under a free trade policy, goods and services can be bought and sold across international borders with little or no government tariffs, quotas, subsidies, or prohibitions to inhibit the exchange of these goods. So basically, free trade is where there are no tariffs, no quotas limiting the amount of product that a country can import from another country. Which sounds beneficial, but there are detrimental sides which I'll be going into later on. In terms of this agreement that was signed with Africa, certain African countries, or sub-Saharan African countries, back in the year 2000, the AGOA agreement is the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It's a United States Trade Act, which was signed with the African countries on the 18th of May 2000. So this agreement is renewed every so often. The next renewal date is this year, 2025. The last time it was renewed in 2015. I don't know why they have to put limitations on it. So it causes a situation where companies are worried about how they do trade with the continent if they're not sure that after a certain period that the trade agreement will be still there, basically. Anyway, let me continue here. The legislation significantly enhances market access to the US for qualifying sub-Saharan African countries. It does that by allocating a special program indicator to approximately 6,800 tariff lines in the US tariff schedule, which allows US importers to clear such goods sourced from eligible countries, African countries, duty-free under the AGOA agreement. So this agreement, in terms of qualifying, they're saying it highlights the importance of rules of origin, because in terms of rules of origin, The products may be made in Africa, in African countries, but the raw materials, for example, in textiles or garments, the textile fabric doesn't have to be made in Africa. It can come from outside, but the garments themselves have to be made on the continent. So there's a type of relaxation of the rules of origin in that sense, but some countries did take advantage of this idea, or even the AGOA agreement itself. Well, I would say companies from Asia took advantage in the early years to bring semi-finished garments into the continent, and then the last stages of assembling or putting together the garment was done on the continent, but they were exported as if they were fully designed and manufactured on the continent. This was done because they knew that there were no tariffs on the goods that were coming from the continent, going from the continent to the US. So to avoid the taxes or tariffs they would have to pay going from probably their own countries, they tried to bypass those areas of international legislation or trade legislation in regards to their own country tariffs. So the waiver allowed these lesser developed beneficiary countries, these African countries, the waiver allowed these countries to use third-party fabrics or yarn and still export clothes under the AGOA preferences. Third party is when you're getting fabric from another country, but you're actually manufacturing the garment in your country. So the other country where you're getting the fabric from is the third party. So just 3 years after the AGOA agreement was signed, countries like Lesotho became eligible for preferences under AGOA clothing exports to the US from one of Africa's poorest landlocked nations. So it's basically, its exports had tripled to 460 million from when they signed the AGOA agreement. And employment was for around 50,000 workers. So exports from African countries such as Kenya, Madagascar, and Malawi, Swaziland, and others also increased dramatically. But as we may see later, that lasted for a while. Things died down because of what the Asian companies were doing. Anyway, let me concentrate on the AGOA structure itself. The qualification for AGOA preferences is based on a set of conditions contained in the AGOA legislation. In order to qualify and to remain eligible for AGOA, the beneficiary country must demonstrate respect for rule of law, human rights, and core labor standards. There you go, human rights again. This is the Western idea of wanting to control how a country governs itself, even before they can do any trade with that country. Unlike China, China is not concerned with those things. They're just concerned with whether they can do business with the country or not. Anyway, let me continue. Beneficiary countries should also not seek to undermine US foreign policy interests. The AGOA eligibility requirements are listed. Okay, this is going to another site. And there are other criteria linked to governance and democracy that African countries must fulfill in order to qualify for AGOA. So basically that your country, it seems here, should be a Western type democracy and have a certain type of governance structure before they can say, yes, we'll allow you to trade or sell your products to the US. So the typical Western method or strategy of trying to control how a country develops, how a country is run, because their concept is based on the idea that if a country has a similar political system or even an economic system to them, it makes it easier for America and the West to influence those countries because they're more similar to them. Countries that have a different way of doing things they see as a threat to their control of the world, you could argue. So anyway, let me continue. And regression, okay. Regression on any of these criteria can lead the United States to revoke a country's qualification for AGOA. Madagascar's AGOA eligibility was in fact revoked between 2009 and 2014, that's for 5 years, due to the country's major political crisis. So the country is going through crisis, which would have affected its economy somehow. And during this period, the US has decided not to trade with the country. This is probably a period when the country is best in need of continued trade with the outside world in order to maintain some economic activity and make sure that the economy is still running. But instead, the U.S. decides to remove Madagascar from its AGOA agreement. Thus, this can also cause even more instability in the country. So moving on to the Caribbean now, that was the AGOA agreement with the Sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of economic partnership agreements, these are intensive alliances signed by two or more countries. It's similar to a free trade agreement that provide reciprocal economic integration and participations. And these, according to this, agreements are proven to be quite popular around the world since the beginning of the 21st century, with nations such as Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific region all joining forces to survive and compete under the regulations of these economic partnership agreements. So the CARIFORUM EU agreement, this is a list based on the EU Commission website. The CARIFORUM EU Economic Partnership Agreement was signed in October 2008. It's not just a trade in goods agreement, it includes commitments on trade in services, investment, trade-related issues such as competition, policy, government procurement, intellectual property, rights, as well as sustainable development aspects, various areas. So there are points they focus on it that it helps two regions to invest and trade with each other. But later on you'll see that the trade is not necessarily equal. Provides predictable market access for EU and Caribbean traders. Yes, it provides a structure in which you know what the regulations are rather than going and trading in a disorganized situation. So it opens the EU market in services including creative and entertainment industries, as well as the Caribbean market for EU service providers. So it supposedly opens up the EU market for Caribbean entertainment, because as we know, the Caribbean region is well known for entertainment and even the hospitality sector. Ensures free, duty-free, quota-free market access to the EU for all products. That one I'll go into later on. EU exports of sensitive products are gradually liberalized over a period of 25 years. So that means this EU exports that over a period of 15 to 25 years, Caribbean countries can slowly reduce their tariffs. Rather than just removing the tariff soon after signing the agreement, you gradually reduce, because you don't want your local producers to be almost hit straight away with foreign goods coming into the country. So you slowly reduce the tariffs to allow your local producers to adapt to the new incoming, or slowly incoming new products from other countries. And that's a clause that some countries, I know in the case I'm going to be discussing later on, some countries didn't really pay attention to that in terms of removing tariffs on some of the products that their local manufacturers are making. But I'll talk about that in a while. There are 14 countries in the CARIFORUM agreement. These are the Dominican Republic, Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. In terms of the tariffs relating to that agreement now, so the EU grants 100% duty and quota-free access for all goods coming from these 14 countries or 14 islands. So the access to the EU market is permanent, full, free, and free for those CARIFORUM countries. CARIFORUM countries phase out duties gradually over 15 to 25 years, as I said. 17% of products and services are considered sensitive and are entirely, so there are some sectors which won't have their tariffs removed in the Caribbean to protect those industries, which is what the free trade agreement includes. There are certain strategic industries in a country, and for example, in the West you talk of maybe military industries. You want to protect those, so you put tariffs on military equipment coming from abroad if your country is manufacturing that product. And let me continue. If the imports of some EU goods into the CARIFORUM countries suddenly surge and threaten local production, safeguards such as import quotas can be applied. So there's certain level in the Caribbean. I don't know about the African. I've not a lot. Well, I'll deal with that particular case in a while. All custom duties can be found in. No, I think that is it for now. Those are the main points from that section that I want to look at. Yeah, that is looking at the agreements and certain aspects of these agreements. So next, I'm looking at these sectors, areas of business in the economy that these things have affected, these agreements have affected. And I'm starting with the Caribbean. CARIFORUM exports appear to have diversified, relying less on mineral fuels and more on food and manufactures. So certainly, I know, for example, Trinidad used to export a lot of oil to Europe, as it has an oil industry. The growth has been the largest in export of chemicals and related products and live food and animals. Looking more closely at these categories, the growth in chemical exports have been driven by the growth of organic chemicals from Trinidad and Tobago. In terms of food and live animals, there has been a strong increase in fish and crustaceans from Jamaica, Belize and Suriname. Fruits and nuts, mainly driven by the Dominican Republic, and cocoa, also from the Dominican Republic. So those are some of the basic commodities that the exports have increased to the EU. But you don't hear much talk about manufacture. There's manufacturers, but not what you might call sophisticated manufactured goods. The decline in Trinidad and Tobago's exports has had a significant influence on total CARIFORUM exports to the EU. This decline is largely related to fuel exports. On the other hand, the Dominican Republic has experienced sustained growth in its exports to the EU, and also Antigua and Barbuda have shown growth. So let's just look at some of the products that have been, I think they were being exported before, but there was an increase in their exportation from the Caribbean to the EU. The tourism sector, they're saying here that it hasn't really been affected by this agreement, because the tourism sector in the Caribbean has been quite strong all along. So it wouldn't have benefited much from this economic agreement or this economic partnership. So that's a brief look at the Caribbean as some of the industries and products that have benefited or been affected by the agreement. In terms of Africa, here it's mentioned that the financial crisis of 2008 and the Eurozone crisis caused a decline in exports from Africa to the America and Europe because of their financial issues. They couldn't import so much goods, as much goods as usual to their countries. However, exports in all countries except Mauritius started increasing again from 2011 onwards, driven by new dynamics, including a shift among remaining foreign investors in Lesotho, Swaziland and Madagascar. They shifted their market basically to more regional markets. When they were exporting to Europe and the US before, during the financial crisis, they shifted their market to Southern Africa, which is better in a sense, because instead of always exporting to Europe, there should be more trade within the continent itself rather than depending on outside sources of income. Mauritanian apparel exports continued to decline, and some Mauritanian firms shifted to Madagascar. So some internal dynamics on the continent in terms of the manufacturing during the period of the financial crisis. And Ethiopia itself, its clothing sector or export sector took off after 2010. I think Ethiopia made a concerted effort to increase its manufacturing and export of clothing and probably other products as well. But I know it made a concerted effort to increase its manufacturing sector by creating incentives for companies to invest in its manufacturing by setting up their manufacturing bases in that region. Clothing exports rose from less than 1 million in 2001 to 13 million in 2010, and then 117 million in 2017. That's a drastic increase Textile exports, however, increased for a while because of Turkish investments in textile factories, but after 2014, due to the shutdown of these firms, the textile exports declined, and the clothing side of things continued to dominate the market. So the rise in exports was, as I was saying, is because of global buyers and producers searching for new low-cost locations. So this idea of low-cost locations is the idea that countries will keep their labor force wages low to attract foreign companies to set up their manufacturing base there. It sounds good in terms of it brings in business, but at the same time it's taking advantage of the working class, the poorer people, in terms of wanting to pay them a minimal wage rather than coming into the country and giving a decent wage to the workers. You're paying them as little as possible because the foreign companies is looking at profits and exploitation rather than really benefiting the country. So that's a look at some of the sectors in Africa and the Caribbean. I'm looking at some statistics now in terms of, although I mentioned a few statistics already, this is a bit more detailed. This one is looking at AGOA. A review of the US trade with AGOA eligible countries since AGOA's inception indicates that the US has imported $790 billion worth of goods between 2001 and 2021, and so in 20 years they've imported almost $1 trillion or $750 billion worth of goods, averaging around 37 billion annually. So the annual value of imports rose nearly threefold from 8.5 billion in 2001 to 21 billion in 2021. I'm not sure what that is. US foreign economic assistance, and I'll leave out the economic assistance, total 141 billion between 2001 through 2019, which is not a lot. The trade was better. They'd have earned more money through the trade than the economic assistance. And continue. This is the Caribbean Council, a report or an article. It makes clear that trade in services was larger in the value than trade in goods over the 10-year review period, and the EU services exports to Caribbean member states nearly doubled from 3.2 billion in 2010 to 5.6 billion in 2018. It confirms that tourism continues to be the most important service sector across the region, and that cultural services, although much smaller, represent a growing opportunity. In 2018, CARIFORM exports to the EU stood at 3.9 billion, while exports from the EU was at 5.1 billion. So according to the report, practically the same as the total trade in 2008 at 9. So basically they're saying from 2008 to 2018, the trade between the Caribbean, exports from the Caribbean to the EU had only increased by 2%, while EU exports to the CARIFORM rose by 4%. So although the increases aren't large, but it's clear that the EU exported more to the Caribbean than the Caribbean to the EU. So whether that was really a financial benefit to the Caribbean, since they're the ones spending more money importing things from Europe than the other way around. So it doesn't seem, although it's uneven, because some countries benefited more from the trade with the EU than others. So here it's saying CARIFORM imports of goods from the US in 2018 were almost 4 times larger than the value imported from the EU. So they're doing a lot more business with America, but then again, America is much nearer than the EU. So you could expect that. Anyway, those are the statistics in relation to trade between the regions. But in reality, the Caribbean hasn't benefited. And the other point that can be discussed is the fact that these economic trade agreements or free trade agreements or economic partnerships haven't really created a situation in which the Caribbean and Africa have diversified their economies or their exports to these regions. Even their economies haven't really diversified away from primary goods, and the exports have not diversified away from minerals and basic produce rather than more advanced manufacturing. there hasn't been much in the way of the transfer of scientific knowledge or manufacturing knowledge between the countries. That's what I could see. Anyway, I'm moving on now to look at some of the negative issues relating to what trade agreements. Here is a case of Ghana, who was part of the economic partnership agreements with the EU, and the fact that it didn't benefit as well as, or in fact some industries suffered as a result of these partnerships with China, not with China, with the EU. So anyway, let me continue here. So here, I'm looking at China at the moment. This is just a brief talk about China. China reveals that the country's clothing manufacturers are reluctant to move to sub-Saharan Africa, which for many companies remains uncharted territory compared to neighboring Asian. So China, although it has set up a number of companies on the continent for manufacturing, is not seeing Africa as a major place to transfer its manufacturing to, because they say it's still uncharted. You know, the amount of Chinese here, is it really uncharted territory? It's quite clear what is going on the continent, so maybe there are ulterior reasons why they don't want to set up on the continent. So let me continue. In terms of foreign direct investment, there's a mention here. It is unable to disentangle the use by multinationals and others of special purpose entities to route financial transactions through the Caribbean. So these are transferring funds. You know that there are certain tax havens, I think, in the Caribbean, and they have this idea of using the Caribbean as a place to almost launder money. You put your money in banks in the Caribbean because it's a safe haven for those countries or companies that don't want to pay taxes in their own countries. So the Caribbean, even though there's a lot of FDI on paper going in, some of that FDI is related to these financial games that these European corporations like to play. And in the Ghana case, as I said, there's according to this report, evidence emerging from those EPA deals have been implemented, such as the interim EU deal with Ghana, corroborates skeptical African governments' fear over the implication of premature tariff dismantling for government revenues and import competing sectors. Ghana's once vibrant tomato and poultry sectors, for instance, are buckling under the weight of cheap foreign importations from the EU member states. In 2023 alone, Netherlands exported $65.7 million worth of poultry meat to Ghana. This was closely followed by Poland, which exported $51.7 million worth of commodities to Ghana, of the same commodity, I should say. And now, again, frozen chicken wings and thighs are regularly dumped on Ghana's market below production costs, since it is often cheaper for European producers to export these chicken parts to Africa than to dispose of them in accordance with EU environment. So rather than dispose of this leftover animal parts or chicken parts, they dump them in Africa very cheaply, undermining the local producers or local growers of these products. And part of these economic partnership agreements is the fact that there's supposed to be, I think there is some kind of stipulation that they can reduce the tariffs at a much slower. Many of the African countries just remove their tariffs almost immediately, rather than going through the gradual process of decreasing their tariffs over a period of 15 years or so they don't find products from Europe being dumped on them. So when products from Europe are coming onto the continent, into a country like Ghana, if it kept its tariffs, then those products wouldn't be on the market at such a cheap price, or they probably wouldn't be in the country in the first place, and there wouldn't be a competition to the local producers. But because they remove their tariffs straight away, which they don't really have to, it's just that they're not following the regulations, they're not paying attention to the regulations or the legislation regarding these agreements. And one of the reasons for that is many of these documents are extensive, and you find many developing countries don't have the staff to go through the documents properly to understand how they can best benefit from these these types of agreements. It is something that has been going on since the 1990s, since the early days of the World Trade Organization. Anyway, let me continue. Tin tomato paste from EU member states such as Italy is also regularly dumped on Ghana's market. These trends have severe repercussions for Ghanaian local farmers who see their domestic market cornered by cheap foreign produce, with apparently dubious credentials. So some of these products are not even healthy, as they go on to say. Poultry and tomato farmers also bitterly complain that the EPA's so-called sensitive goods basket that is meant to protect vulnerable producers is wholly insufficient, namely that even the application of a 35% tariff this is saying that even though the tariffs are there, it's still not enough. The prices that the EU sells to Ghana at is so low that the tariffs don't make a difference. The application, but then again, they could use a quota system, that even the application of 35% tariff against EU imports in these sensitive sectors is inadequate, given that European goods are being dumped in huge quantities, often below production costs, to the detriment of local farmers. Yeah, anyway, it does mention South Africa as well, so maybe they're also having issues. Anyway, there's another issue around this disorganizing of local industries, and this is to do with migration. Let me continue. Evidence from Ghana also suggests that the collapse of farms and livelihoods in sectors such as poultry and tomato is acting as a push factor for intercontinental migration to Europe. A poultry farm employs around 30 to 50 persons, with the largest co-operators in Ghana employing up to 500 people. Commercial tomato farmers similarly employ up to 50 people during harvest. Let me go on to the point that I want to emphasize. Poultry and tomato farmers show that the loss of jobs under the weight of imports flooding first promotes rural-urban migration, with Ghana from northern and central regions to the capital, Accra. Once in Accra, redundant agricultural laborers then accrue sufficient resources within the informal economy to attempt intercontinental migration to Europe. Interestingly, some Ghanaian laborers made redundant by cheap importations have migrated to Italy to work in the shadow economy of the Italian tomato fields. So they've left working in their own tomato industry in Ghana, in their own country, to work in the tomato industry of a European country, because their own tomato industry has been decimated by cheap products from Europe, cheap tomato products from Europe. Anyway, this is related to migration as well. The EU trade policies accordingly are not only problematic in terms of food security, livelihoods, and economic diversification in African countries. They are also problematic in terms of European Commission expressed desire to deal with the root causes of migration in the context of EPAs. So these economic agreements or free trade agreements, when they cause disorganization in the industries in these countries, what it creates is a situation where the workers in these, or the former workers in these industries, may end up finding themselves in Europe working in the same industry that was decimated back in their own country. So free trade and this idea of Europeans you can see in that case, in the food case, I think it's the chicken case, you find that European countries are dumping cheap products or leftover products onto the African market at such a low rate that the local producers can't compete. But then again, there should be ways that African governments can do something about that. They shouldn't just allow these things to come into the country and disorganize their economy. So we can blame Europe to a certain extent, but also African economies need to take a look at, or the government need to take a look at the type of things that they allow into the country. Several African countries' governments, including Tanzania and Nigeria, raised serious concerns about the implications of premature EPA liberalization for their import competing agricultural sectors and nascent manufacturing. So these countries were concerned about it. As a result, implementation of EPAs in African sub-regions have remained haphazard. It means that some countries have not implemented these policies because they can actually see the dangers that are there in terms of how they protect their own industries from these imports from the EU. The EU's only functional regional agreement in the continent are the Southern African states, or with Southern African states, namely the Eastern and Southern African ESA and the Southern African Development Community. In other sub-regions, including West Africa and East Africa, regional deals remain stalled as key players such as Nigeria refuse to implement the agreements on the basis of protecting their vital industries such as domestic poultry production. So Nigeria at least is one country that seems to be very concerned. But then even without these EPAs, there's some protection that governments can really provide the industries from these foreign companies that are dumping their products there. And in terms of aid, lower middle income African countries such as Ghana, which are compelled to sign these agreements, because these countries, they receive some amount of aid from the EU or America. So the bribery is that if you don't sign this economic agreement or partnership agreement, we'll withhold the aid that we have been providing you. So although the idea of the trade agreement seems amicable and okay, behind the scenes it seems some level of coercion is taking place in order for Europe. That means that the Europeans see themselves as benefiting more from the deal than the African countries if they're so insistent on that you should sign the deal. Otherwise, we're not going to continue providing the aid that you require. Though African countries should turn away from this thing called aid, as the idea of aid is it creates a type of dependency which creates situations like this in which a country is pressured into doing things or signing agreements that it doesn't really want to, or it has questions about. So I think it's about time African countries moved away from this aid scenario and finds ways of financing its own development or focusing more on trade, even within the continent, than being dependent on regions of the world that are always looking to take advantage for their own benefit, or in some cases to make sure that African countries remain underdeveloped. This one is about AGOA. No, that one I've covered already, I think. So anyway, in terms of the future now, these is from a document or an article concerning where the future of industries on the continent is going. Anyway, first and foremost, technological innovations, that is rapid digitalization and the introduction of robots in manufacturing processes, is about to redefine the future economic landscape and division of labor in the global clothing industry. However, as our field research shows, this process is gradual, not disruptive. We estimate that in light of a considerable gap between the technological feasibility of a new robotic technology, countries are likely to, and their commercial viability, sub-Saharan African countries are likely to have a time window of 10 to 15 years to push industrialization based on clothing exports. So it's saying basically that in the next 10 to 15 years, African countries should concentrate on developing their industrialization in order not to be challenged or threatened by this new automation or robotic manufacturing that is coming in the not too distant future. Technological upgrading in established production locations and relocation to low-wage countries are not mutually exclusive, and indeed are often pursued simultaneously by leading clothing firms. So there's something relating to relying on low-wage labor, or whether they should bring in robotics in the Western world anyway. So there's this threat or issue around in the future, the idea of manufacturing garments in these less developed countries for the wealthy country markets may not be a viable option anymore, since automation and robotics may cause production in these wealthy countries to be actually cheaper than producing in a poorer country. That is the argument they're saying here, it seems. Importantly, digital technological innovation is accompanied by, and indeed enforcing, a trend towards new business models. I think this is more to do with the fashion industry than the general clothing market itself, because they're talking about the time to market period becomes shorter. So there'll be shorter manufacturing periods, or you manufacture to demand rather than manufacturing to put in a supermarket or a store that the product is going to sit there. So it's more about manufacturing for demand, and that certain African countries can take advantage of that. They did mention Ethiopia in one section and Northern Africa in terms of manufacturing closer to the European market. Two broader success factors need to be in place. One, on one hand, preferential trade agreements, which are there, which so far have been critically important for directing investment flows to low-income countries in both Asia and Africa, need to stay alive to compensate for productivity shortcomings. This applies in particular to EB and AGOA, the future of which is subject to political uncertainties. This political uncertainties of AGOA, as I said before, is the fact that the agreement is only signed for periods of 10 years, 8 years, or 5 years, and it's expiring this year. So later on, I think it's September, they're supposed to renew the AGOA agreement. But this can make producers who may have set up their base in Africa to start a business, if they set up their business in 2021, after 4 years, they'll be now worried about whether the agreement is still going to be there for them to. That can also deter companies from coming this side, even though they shouldn't really be dependent on foreign companies coming in. There should be indigenous countries being set up to manufacture for export, rather than being dependent on foreign companies coming in and investing and manufacturing mainly for their own benefit and profits, rather than for benefiting the African continent. Anyway, that was a look at some of the issues around these free trade agreements. The one thing I haven't mentioned is this AGOA, relating to this AGOA. Let me have a look and see if I can find it. There was an issue that I wanted to discuss, but I think I'll discuss it another time, relating to the AGOA agreement. Let me have a look and see if it's here. No, it's not here. Okay, what it relates to, a few years ago, around 2017, 2018, there was an issue around the second-hand clothes being dumped in Africa or exported to Africa from the US, and that it's supposed to be part of the AGOA agreement. What it's really saying about the AGOA agreement is that there's supposed to be no restrictions on the type of goods that can be exported from the US to Africa. It's not specifically talking about second-hand goods, but it's basically saying that the US can export whatever it wants. Basically, there's no restriction on the type of goods, and supposedly vice versa, on the type of goods that they export to Africa. So when the East African countries decided they no longer wanted to import second-hand clothes from America, the US government, I think it was President was Trump at the time, was talking about putting certain sanctions and certain strategies against the continent, these countries that no longer wanted to export second-hand goods. So one of the problems is with free trade agreements, particularly with the US, is that when you have such an agreement and a country wants to develop its own particular sector, like East Africa wants to develop its garment and clothing sector, so it has decided now we no longer want second-hand clothes, we want to manufacture new clothes rather than people's old clothes from Europe or America. And then you find these Western countries putting pressure on a country because it no longer wants to start its own manufacturing base of clean clothes, you can almost say, rather than although the clothes are said to be clean or good condition. A country prefers to import or manufacture its own goods rather than import second-hand items from another country. But a free trade agreement such as the one signed with Africa allows the US a certain amount of freedom in terms of what it can export, or it claims it allows it certain. But then again, this AGOA agreement does allow for certain stipulations when a country wants to give a certain amount of protection to its industries, or its new industries or young industries. So whether they looked at that issue properly, the US, I'm not sure whether it had grounds to stand on, or maybe it was just trying to behave like a bully in making sure that its industries, or its so-called second-hand clothes industry. I forgot the name of it, Smart or something like that, because they protested to the U.S. government. So the U.S. government went ahead to defend its so-called producers or its exporters, and put some pressure on, tried to put some pressure. In fact, they did. I know some East African countries changed their mind because of that pressure. But I know Rwanda didn't change its mind. Up to now, I think Rwanda has refused to import second-hand clothes. All countries really should stop the importation of second-hand clothes, because to me, that is one of the priority products that a country should have for itself: its own clothes, its own food, its own property market, its own medicine, herbal medicine and traditional medicine, its own spiritual and religious practices. These are some of the things that a society should have for itself and not be dependent on others for. So anyway, that's a brief look at the free trade and economic partnership concepts and agreements between Africa and Europe and America. That's it for today.